Greenland does not erupt into history through invasion or declaration. It exerts influence through presence alone. A continent-sized mass of ice positioned between hemispheres, it applies pressure without movement, leverage without spectacle. In strategic terms, it is not a battlefield awaiting conflict. It is a fixed coordinate around which conflict reorganizes itself. Geography here is not a backdrop, it is an instrument. From the altitude of surveillance satellites, Greenland appears inert, a frozen expanse immune to urgency. From the perspective of strategic command, it is a compression point where time, distance, and decision-making collapse inward. Missile trajectories arc across its skies. Submarine patrol routes trace its undersea contours. Early warning systems depend on its latitude to distinguish between noise and annihilation. Greenland shortens the distance between rivals while lengthening the margin for reaction. And in doing so, it quietly alters the balance of deterrence. Power does not always manifest through movement. Sometimes it manifests through denial. Greenland denies obscurity. It denies neutrality. Its position forces itself into calculations whether planners wish it or not. In an era defined by mobile threats and transient alliances, fixed geography regains relevance. Greenland does not maneuver to remain important. It remains important because everything else moves around it. The illusion surrounding Greenland is emptiness. Ice implies absence. Absence implies irrelevance. This assumption has persisted long past its expiration. Empty terrain is not neutral terrain. It is permissive terrain. It allows infrastructure to be embedded without social friction, surveillance to be deployed without witnesses, and strategic systems to operate without the political noise generated elsewhere. The ice conceals as much as it reveals. Beneath it, facilities can be buried. Across it, sensors can be dispersed. Above it, air corridors can be controlled with minimal civilian interference. The absence of population is not a weakness. It is an enabling condition. Every modern strategic system contains pressure points, locations where failure or loss of access produces cascading effects. Greenland occupies several simultaneously. It anchors radar horizons that feed continental defense networks. It supports communication relays that stabilize command and control. It sits adjacent to sea lanes that are transitioning from seasonal anomalies to permanent corridors. None of these functions are dramatic. All of them are decisive. The relevance of Greenland does not stem from what is currently visible on its surface. It stems from what can be scaled there faster than elsewhere. Runways can be extended. Ports can be deepened. Sensor arrays can be upgraded and integrated into existing architectures. Once these processes cross certain thresholds, reversal becomes politically costly and strategically impractical. Greenland therefore represents a form of preemptive advantage, not dominance seized through force, but advantage locked in through early positioning. This is why discussions surrounding Greenland rarely remain confined to their stated purpose. Proposals framed as economic cooperation drift toward security guarantees. Scientific research agreements intersect with terrain mapping and seabed analysis. Climate monitoring overlaps with logistical rehearsal. Ice melt is not merely an environmental variable. It is a timeline against which strategic opportunity is measured. Pressure around Greenland accumulates incrementally. No single decision transforms it into a focal point of global competition. Instead, a sequence of rational, defensible actions slowly alters the strategic environment. A radar upgrade justified by modernization, a port feasibility study framed as commercial development, a revised Arctic policy articulated in neutral language. Each action appears benign in isolation. Together, they redraw the map. Greenland exerts gravitational pull precisely because it offers predictability. Its location will not change. Its relevance will increase as other regions become saturated or unstable. In strategic planning, constants are rare. Greenland is one of them. It anchors models that require fixed reference points in a world otherwise defined by volatility. The question often posed is whether Greenland is the key to controlling the world. The framing is flawed. Control in the modern system is diffuse, distributed across networks rather than territories. Greenland does not grant control. It mitigates loss. It reduces vulnerability. It strengthens deterrence by stabilizing certain variables while competitors contest others. In this sense, Greenland is less a prize than an insurance policy, one that only becomes visible when threatened. Silence surrounds Greenland, not because it is unimportant, but because those who understand its role have no incentive to advertise it. Strategic value increases when it remains understated. Public debate introduces friction. Friction invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites opposition. The most effective use of Greenland occurs beneath the threshold of attention. This does not mean Greenland is uncontested. It is contested continuously, but through methods that do not resemble traditional confrontation. Investment decisions, access agreements, regulatory influence, and presence signaling all function as instruments of competition. The contest is not about flags or borders. It is about who shapes the operational environment before a crisis forces clarity. The inevitability surrounding Greenland is not the inevitability of conflict. It is the inevitability of inclusion. Any comprehensive model of global security, supply chain resilience, or nuclear stability must account for it. Omission creates blind spots. Blind spots create risk. Risk is intolerable in systems designed to prevent catastrophic failure. Greenland, therefore, occupies a paradoxical position. It is both peripheral and central, isolated and integrated, static and dynamic. It does not generate events, it amplifies them. When signals appear elsewhere, their interpretation is filtered through systems anchored in Greenland. When tensions rise in distant theaters, contingency planning references its infrastructure. When deterrence is recalibrated, its latitude re-enters the equation. What lies behind Greenland is not a hidden weapon or a singular secret. It is structural leverage produced by geography, enhanced by technology, and activated by competition. The ice does not conceal intent, it concentrates it. The world does not revolve around Greenland, but the systems that prevent its collapse increasingly do. Greenland remains silent. It does not signal ambition. It does not threaten. It simply exists at the intersection of trajectories that cannot avoid it. In strategic terms, that is enough. Greenland's contemporary strategic relevance is not the product of sudden discovery or modern anxiety. It is the accumulated outcome of historical decisions made under vastly different conditions, each layering new purpose onto an island long perceived as marginal. To understand why Greenland now occupies a central position in global strategic calculations, it is necessary to examine how empires, alliances, and institutions gradually redefined its value as technology, compressed distance, and warfare escaped the constraints of geography. For centuries, Greenland existed on the periphery of imperial consciousness. Its early incorporation into European systems of control was symbolic rather than operational. Administratively linked to distant capitals, Greenland functioned as a territorial extension without strategic urgency. Its environment resisted exploitation. Its population density offered little economic incentive. In an era where power projection depended on proximity, logistics, and manpower, Greenland offered none in sufficient quantity. This perception began to erode as global systems expanded. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked a shift in how states understood space. Advances in navigation, communication, and industrial capacity allowed empires to think beyond contiguous borders. Geography was no longer an obstacle alone. It became an asset if integrated correctly. Greenland, however, remained largely outside these early transformations, still constrained by ice and distance. The turning point arrived not through political ambition, but through war. The Second World War transformed the strategic logic of the North Atlantic. Air power reduced oceans from barriers to corridors. Weather became a critical variable in transoceanic operations. Control of meteorological data translated directly into operational advantage. Greenland's location, once irrelevant, became indispensable. Weather stations established on its territory fed data into Allied planning cycles, influencing naval movements and aerial deployments across the Atlantic. This wartime utilization established a precedent that would outlast the conflict itself. Greenland had demonstrated utility not as a battlefield, but as a support node. It did not host mass formations, it hosted systems. This distinction would define its future role. The onset of the Cold War institutionalized Greenland's strategic significance. The emergence of nuclear weapons and intercontinental delivery systems restructured global security around early warning and deterrent stability. Missile trajectories followed the shortest paths between continents, passing through polar regions. Reaction time became the most valuable commodity in strategic planning. Greenland's latitude offered marginal increases in warning time that translated into survivability at scale. Agreements negotiated during this period embedded Greenland into a larger security architecture. These arrangements were framed as defensive necessities, justified by existential threat perceptions. Sovereignty was preserved formally, but access was granted functionally. Infrastructure was constructed with permanence in mind. Radar installations, airfields, and communication links were integrated into continental defense systems. Greenland became a fixed node in an abstract network designed to prevent nuclear exchange. These decisions were not temporary. They created path dependence. Once systems were built around Greenland, alternatives became cost prohibitive. The island's role was no longer optional, it was assumed. During the latter half of the 20th century, Greenland's strategic profile stabilized. Its presence in defense planning was constant, but rarely publicized. The logic of deterrence demanded discretion. Visibility invited targeting. Silence became part of the architecture. Greenland's importance was maintained through maintenance rather than expansion. The end of bipolar confrontation briefly altered this equilibrium. The dissolution of existential threat narratives reduced urgency. Budgets contracted. Infrastructure aged. Strategic attention drifted elsewhere. For a moment, Greenland appeared to recede once again into obscurity. This period, however, was an intermission rather than an ending. The early 21st century introduced conditions that reactivated Greenland's relevance. Climate change altered the physical environment, reducing ice coverage and extending navigable periods. What had once been permanently frozen became seasonally accessible. Sea routes that existed only in theoretical models began to appear on logistical charts. Accessibility changed the cost-benefit analysis that had previously constrained ambition. Simultaneously, global resource dynamics shifted. Rare earth elements, hydrocarbons, and freshwater reserves gained strategic value as industrial demand increased and supply chains became politicized. Greenland's geological potential moved from abstraction to planning consideration. Resource access became inseparable from security planning. The reemergence of great power competition provided the final catalyst. As trust eroded and deterrence logic reasserted itself, fixed geography regained importance. Mobile systems dominated headlines, but planners understood their limitations. Satellites could be disrupted. Mobile launch platforms could be tracked. Fixed nodes offered stability in modeling and predictability in response. Historical agreements now constrained contemporary maneuvering. Existing access rights shaped who could operate and how quickly. Legacy infrastructure dictated modernization paths. Political arrangements limited overt militarization while enabling incremental expansion. History did not merely explain Greenland's role, it actively structured it. The island's internal political evolution added complexity. Movements toward greater autonomy introduced new variables into strategic calculations. External actors could no longer treat Greenland as administratively invisible. Influence required negotiation rather than assumption. This did not reduce strategic interest. It altered its expression. Economic engagement, infrastructure investment, and regulatory alignment became tools of positioning. Greenland's history thus reveals a pattern of delayed recognition followed by institutional entrenchment. Each time global systems evolved, Greenland's relevance increased after initial neglect. Each time, adaptation lagged behind technological change. The present moment follows this pattern with greater speed and higher stakes. What distinguishes the current era is the compression of time. Historical decisions that once unfolded across decades now generate consequences within planning cycles measured in years. Greenland's past limits the flexibility of the present, while the present accelerates the relevance of the past. Greenland was never destined to remain peripheral. It was waiting for systems capable of exploiting its position. Those systems now exist. The historical context does not suggest inevitability of conflict. It suggests inevitability of attention. Greenland has crossed the threshold beyond which it cannot be ignored without consequence. Strategic institutions do not interpret Greenland as territory in the conventional sense. They interpret it as a system multiplier. Its value is calculated not by population, economic output, or political influence, but by how effectively it compresses space, time, and uncertainty within high-consequence decision cycles. Greenland's relevance emerges most clearly when examined through the doctrines that govern deterrence, escalation control, and force survivability. At the center of this analysis lies distance. Modern warfare, particularly at the strategic level, is governed by how quickly a signal can be detected, interpreted, and acted upon. Greenland's position reduces physical distance between potential adversaries while simultaneously increasing informational distance through early warning. This dual effect is critical. It shortens weapon flight paths while extending decision windows. In deterrence theory, this asymmetry stabilizes systems by reducing the incentive for preemptive action while increasing confidence in second strike capability. Early warning doctrine relies on layered detection. Sensors positioned closer to likely trajectories improve discrimination between false signals and genuine launches. Greenland enables this layering. Radar coverage from its latitude intersects with orbital tracking and maritime surveillance to form an integrated picture. This integration is not neutral. Data flows into specific command architectures, reinforcing existing power structures. Control over interpretation becomes as important as detection itself. Military planning treats Greenland as a fixed anchor in otherwise fluid environments. Unlike mobile platforms, its location cannot be disguised or redeployed. This immobility allows planners to model scenarios with higher confidence. Predictability reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty stabilizes deterrence relationships. Greenland's value, therefore, is not offensive. It is stabilizing, but only for those embedded within its systems. Air power doctrine further amplifies Greenland's role. Long-range aviation depends on refueling, diversion airfields, and reliable navigation corridors. Greenland provides redundancy in transpolar routes that bypass congested airspace elsewhere. In crisis scenarios, this redundancy translates into resilience. Assets can be repositioned without signaling escalation overtly. Presence can be maintained without mass deployment. Naval strategy intersects through the Arctic maritime domain. As ice coverage diminishes, northern sea routes evolve from seasonal anomalies into strategic alternatives. These routes reduce transit time between industrial centers and bypass traditional choke points vulnerable to interdiction. Control over these corridors does not require permanent fleet presence. It requires monitoring, logistics support, and rapid access. Greenland's coastline and proximity enable all three. Deterrence in the Arctic differs fundamentally from deterrence in other theaters. The environment limits sustained combat operations. Escalation would likely be rapid, system-centric, and technologically mediated rather than troop-intensive. This shifts emphasis toward pre-positioned infrastructure, sensor networks, and command integration. Greenland's terrain supports these requirements without necessitating visible militarization. Dual-use infrastructure blurs the line between civilian and military activity, complicating adversary response. Political incentives shape how these capabilities are pursued. Democratic systems must balance transparency with strategic necessity. Authoritarian systems may prioritize speed and opacity, but face legitimacy constraints in international forums. Alliances introduce coordination costs, but also amplify reach. Greenland sits at the intersection of these dynamics, influenced by multiple actors while fully controlled by none. Escalation logic treats Greenland as both asset and liability. Its integration into nuclear command and control architectures increases its value, but also its attractiveness as a target. Damage to its systems would degrade early warning and communication, increasing uncertainty during crises. This vulnerability reinforces the need for protection, which in turn increases visibility. The feedback loop intensifies. Institutions plan for denial as much as access. Preventing adversaries from leveraging Greenland's geography may be as important as exploiting it oneself. Anti-access and area denial concepts extend into the Arctic through long-range sensors and strike capabilities. Greenland's terrain supports these strategies by providing elevation, coverage, and proximity without requiring overt force concentration. Economic strategy intersects with military planning through resource control. Advanced weapons systems depend on rare earth elements and stable supply chains. Greenland's geological potential introduces an additional layer of strategic calculation. Control over extraction rights translates into leverage over industrial capacity. Institutions responsible for long-term force readiness incorporate these variables into planning horizons measured in decades rather than years. Strategic analysis also accounts for institutional inertia. Once systems are built and doctrines codified, adaptation becomes difficult. Greenland's role becomes self-reinforcing. War games incorporate it as an assumption. Professional education embeds it into strategic thinking. Over time, alternatives atrophy, flexibility decreases, dependence increases. This dependence is not irrational. It is the product of optimization under constraint. Greenland fits existing systems too well to be replaced easily. Its geography complements current technologies and doctrines. Recreating its advantages elsewhere would require massive investment with uncertain payoff. Institutions therefore double down on what already works. The result is a strategic environment where Greenland's importance grows independent of intent. No actor needs to seek dominance explicitly. Rational planning under competitive conditions produces convergence. Each institution, acting defensively, reinforces the island's centrality. Strategic analysis strips away narratives of conquest and ambition. What remains is a system seeking stability in an unstable world. Greenland provides fixed reference points in a landscape otherwise defined by mobility and volatility. It is not a catalyst for conflict. It is a stabilizer that, if disrupted, could accelerate escalation dynamics beyond control. In this sense, Greenland functions as both keystone and constraint. It holds structures together while limiting maneuver. Its presence reduces uncertainty for some while increasing vulnerability for others. Strategic institutions accept this trade-off because the alternative is greater instability. Greenland is not the key to controlling the world. It is a mechanism for preventing loss of control. In systems designed to manage catastrophic risk, that distinction is decisive. When strategic systems converge on a fixed node, consequences propagate outward along institutional, regional, and temporal axes. Greenland's increasing integration into global security architectures does not produce immediate confrontation. It generates alignment effects that reshape behavior long before crisis thresholds are crossed. These effects are cumulative, structural, and resistant to reversal. The first consequence is the quiet militarization of space without the visible presence of armies. Surveillance density increases. Data throughput expands. Maintenance cycles shorten. What changes is not the number of troops on the ground, but the intensity of observation and readiness layered above and around the island. This alters regional baselines. Activities that would once have triggered concern are normalized. The threshold for attention rises, narrowing the margin for surprise. As baselines shift, neighboring states recalibrate their own postures. Exercises expand in scope and frequency. Doctrine updates incorporate Arctic contingencies that were previously theoretical. Procurement priorities adjust toward cold weather capability, long-range sensing, and resilient communications. These responses are framed as defensive modernization, yet collectively they thicken the strategic environment. Density replaces distance as the defining characteristic. Alliance dynamics absorb strain. Greenland's role complicates burden sharing and command authority. Investments required to sustain Arctic infrastructure are significant and persistent. Debates emerge over who pays, who commands, and who bears risk. These debates do not fracture alliances outright, but they introduce friction that must be managed continuously. Unity becomes procedural rather than assumed. Economic consequences follow security alignment. Increased strategic interest attracts capital, expertise, and regulatory attention. Infrastructure development accelerates under the justification of resilience and connectivity. This development reshapes local governance pressures. Authorities face competing demands for autonomy, environmental protection, and strategic accommodation. Each decision carries external implications, even when framed as internal policy. Resource exploration intensifies under strategic shadow. Geological surveys inform not only extraction feasibility, but also long-term supply chain security. Control over access rights becomes a lever in broader negotiations. This lever is subtle. It operates through standards, permits, and investment screening rather than force. Yet its effects reach deep into industrial planning for advanced systems dependent on stable inputs. Second-order effects emerge in doctrine. As Greenland becomes embedded in planning assumptions, flexibility erodes. War games incorporate its availability as a constant. Contingency plans assume uninterrupted access. Redundancy elsewhere is deprioritized due to cost and complexity. This concentration improves efficiency under normal conditions while increasing systemic risk under disruption. Third-order effects manifest in crisis management. Increased reliance on sensor integration and automated processing accelerates decision cycles. Human judgment is compressed by data volume and time pressure. In Arctic environments where atmospheric conditions complicate interpretation, false positives carry elevated risk. Confidence in systems becomes both a strength and a vulnerability. Information dynamics further complicate the landscape. Public narratives lag behind strategic reality, creating gaps between perception and practice. Silence is interpreted as intent. Routine activity is read through competitive lenses. Information operations exploit these gaps, amplifying ambiguity without crossing overt thresholds. The contest extends into perception management, where restraint must be demonstrated without revealing capability. Arms control frameworks feel indirect pressure. Systems supported by Arctic infrastructure influence verification and compliance debates, even when negotiations focus elsewhere. Transparency measures must account for capabilities that are technically defensive, yet strategically consequential. Trust becomes conditional, contingent on shared interpretations of data that may not align. Environmental consequences intersect with security planning. Infrastructure in fragile ecosystems introduces long-term liabilities. Accidents or degradation would have transboundary effects, complicating responsibility and response. Strategic competition does not pause for remediation. Instead, it incorporates risk into acceptable margins, further entangling environmental stability with security calculus. None of these consequences require hostile intent. They arise from rational adaptation to perceived necessity. Each actor responds to signals generated by others. The system evolves through feedback rather than design. What stabilizes deterrence at one level introduces fragility at another. Over time, entrenchment replaces choice. Once investments are sunk and doctrines codified, reversal becomes unlikely. Even shifts in political leadership encounter institutional inertia. Greenland's integration into strategic systems thus acquires momentum independent of any single decision or actor. The broader consequence is systemic stress distributed across regions. Attention and resources flow northward, reducing elasticity elsewhere. Opportunity costs accumulate. Yet institutions accept these costs because the perceived risk of neglect is greater. Strategic logic prioritizes preventing catastrophic failure over optimizing for efficiency. Greenland does not generate these consequences by acting. It generates them by being indispensable. Its geography anchors assumptions that propagate through planning cycles, procurement decisions, and alliance coordination. The island's silence masks the extent of its influence. The cumulative effect is a strategic environment more rigid and more sensitive to disruption. Stability is maintained through constant adjustment rather than equilibrium. The system becomes resilient to known risks while increasingly exposed to unknown ones. In this environment, outcomes are shaped less by intent than by structure. Decisions made to reduce uncertainty in one domain increase coupling in another. Greenland sits at the center of this coupling, binding early warning, mobility, resource access, and alliance politics into a single node. The consequence is not collapse, it is a narrowing of options. As Greenland's role deepens, the range of acceptable deviation shrinks. The system tolerates fewer surprises. When deviation occurs, response must be faster, more decisive, and less forgiving. Greenland remains unchanged in appearance. Ice persists, weather cycles continue. Yet beneath this constancy, the strategic architecture around it tightens. Pressure accumulates without release, shaping behavior across distances that far exceed the island itself. Escalation is not a moment. It is a condition produced when systems designed for stability begin to overlap under stress. Around Greenland, that condition forms gradually, marked not by overt hostility, but by an accumulation of signals that reduce interpretive space. Each signal is defensible. Together, they compress time. The first indicators appear in tempo rather than posture. Patrol patterns adjust, transit frequencies increase. Surveillance coverage becomes continuous rather than periodic. These changes do not violate norms, they recalibrate them. What was once exceptional becomes routine. Routine becomes baseline. Baseline becomes expectation. The environment grows denser without appearing more aggressive. Command institutions respond by refining readiness. Alert statuses are reviewed. Response protocols are tested under the justification of maintenance and training. These actions are procedural, yet they are observable. Observation feeds adversary assessment cycles. Assessment cycles produce counter-adjustments. The system begins to oscillate. Infrastructure activity accelerates. Upgrades proceed under civilian and scientific mandates. Runways are resurfaced. Communications bandwidth expands. Power generation capacity increases. Each improvement enhances resilience while also increasing military utility. Dual-use ambiguity persists, complicating interpretation. Intent becomes inferred rather than stated. Diplomatic signaling shifts in parallel. Language grows narrower and more conditional. References to cooperation are paired with clauses emphasizing obligations and contingencies. Legal interpretations are revisited. Frameworks once treated as settled are reopened for clarification. Clarification introduces friction. Friction invites scrutiny. Technological integration adds another layer of risk. Advanced sensors improve detection fidelity, but also generate higher data volumes. Automated processing reduces latency, but constrains deliberation. In Arctic environments, atmospheric distortion and electromagnetic variability complicate interpretation. False positives become harder to dismiss quickly. Confidence in systems replaces confidence in judgment. Greenland's integration into early warning architectures magnifies the consequences of error. Any anomaly detected at this latitude carries strategic weight. Decision-makers must act under compressed timelines with incomplete information. The margin between caution and delay narrows. The cost of hesitation rises. Exercises grow more complex. Scenarios incorporate multiple domains simultaneously. Air, maritime, and space elements intersect. These exercises are announced, yet their scale alters perception. Observers note alignment with broader geopolitical tensions. Timing becomes suggestive. Coincidence is reinterpreted as coordination. Information environments respond accordingly. Selective disclosures shape narratives. Silence is employed strategically. Ambiguity becomes a tool. Public discourse lags behind operational reality, creating gaps that speculation fills. Perception management becomes inseparable from posture management. The escalation dynamic is reinforced by institutional memory. Past crises inform present thresholds. Historical near misses are studied and internalized. Lessons intended to prevent repetition also sensitize systems to patterns that may or may not recur. Pattern recognition accelerates response at the expense of contextual nuance. As signals accumulate, coordination mechanisms are stressed. Communication channels remain open but are burdened by volume and urgency. Messages are precise yet dense. Misinterpretation becomes more likely as time pressure increases. Redundancy exists, but redundancy requires synchronization. Synchronization consumes time. Greenland's role in this phase is passive yet central. It does not generate signals, it concentrates them. Activities elsewhere are interpreted through systems anchored to its geography. A deviation detected near its approaches resonates across command networks. The island functions as an amplifier. Escalation theory emphasizes thresholds, but thresholds are not fixed. They shift with context and expectation. What once would have triggered de-escalation measures now prompts monitoring. What once prompted monitoring now prompts readiness. The latter compresses. At this stage, the distinction between signaling and preparation blurs. Moves intended to reassure allies are read as consolidation by adversaries. Measures intended to deter are read as rehearsal. Intent becomes secondary to capability and timing. The most dangerous phase is not the initiation of action, but the period when systems are primed and waiting. Readiness states elevate. Assets remain on standby. Command authorities receive continuous updates. The environment becomes sensitive to deviation. Greenland's strategic value now introduces risk. Its infrastructure is too important to ignore and too integrated to be isolated. Protection measures increase visibility. Visibility increases targeting considerations. The logic of denial intersects with the logic of defense. Temporal coupling intensifies. Events in unrelated theaters influence interpretation in the Arctic. Crises elsewhere draw attention and resources. Bandwidth narrows. Decision-makers rely more heavily on automated assessments. Human oversight becomes supervisory rather than directive. signals continue to arrive. A track deviates slightly from expected parameters. A transmission is delayed. An exercise extends longer than planned. Each anomaly is minor. The pattern they form is not. At this point, escalation is no longer hypothetical. It is procedural. Systems behave as designed under assumptions of risk. Options narrow. Reversal requires deliberate intervention, which requires time that may not be available. The briefing would normally transition into contingency pathways and response matrices. Those sections remain restricted. What is observable is the convergence of readiness indicators and the compression of decision cycles. Greenland's role shifts from passive anchor to active variable. The final internal assessment notes increased probability of inadvertent confrontation under conditions of elevated activity and reduced interpretive margin, particularly if concurrent crises degrade coordination and force reliance on automated alerting mechanisms that cannot fully account for environmental distortion or adversary signaling practices at thigh latitudes, where data quality fluctuates and confidence must be inferred rather than confirmed, and the system flags an anomaly that does not immediately resolve, and additional inputs begin to correlate and the timeline for clarification shortens. SAS command authorities review the feed and forward elements remain poised, and the distinction between exercise and event becomes ambiguous, and the next update is expected but has not yet arrived, and the record pauses as the analyst attempts to contextualize the developing pattern and notes that once the system transitions from monitoring to active posture, the range of available responses contracts sharply, and that the critical variable becomes interpretation within a narrowing window that is already closing. And the last readable line indicates that further escalation will depend on decisions made before the next cycle completes. And the S Minton Smith thought, as the transmission is interrupted and the archive logs at priority break, while the analyst begins to write that the indicators now suggest shift that will redefine Greenland's role from stabilizing constant to dynamic factor, and that when this transition is acknowledged, the strategic calculus across the northern hemisphere will enter a phase where assumptions no longer hold, and the only remaining question is when.